And it reminded me that that's exactly how I felt when I got to hug Bob and Jackie and spend some time with them last week. Last week was exactly what the doctor ordered for what I needed. I hadn't seen the closest thing I have to a mom and a dad since almost a year ago. We figured out it was 3 weeks shy of a year since we had been able to be together. And it was just great to see them and spend time with them. They send their kind regards. They really missed being able to be here this winter and to snowbird with us, and they wanted you all to know how much they missed you. And as a bonus, I also got to spend a little bit of time with my sister-in-law, Kelly, and with the worst niece ever, Darby. So it was great to be with her and have a good time with her. And we just really had a wonderful visit. And then it capped off by being able to go and attend the wedding of Miles Hester, who worshiped with us a few years ago, and see him tie the knot with his new wife, Claire. And there were a lot of former and current Valricans who were also there as well. So it was great to be able to hang out and be together. So I desperately needed last week, and so glad that I was able to have the opportunity to finally go and visit with family. But I want you to know that you guys were very much on my mind last week, both for good reasons and then also for sad reasons. For good reasons, particularly because of the appointment of 3 new elders and 5 new deacons, all men that I think the world of and their families, and so excited for how I think they're going to contribute to our work here together. But also last week was a sad one. It was a tough one. The concern that we would have a significant outbreak of the virus among us has weighed very heavily on my heart for over a year. And we had been able to dodge it other than mostly sporadic cases, like mine, for example, back in September. In fact, Mickey and I had it about the same time. But to have so many of us either have the virus or be exposed to it in a very short period of time was very concerning. And then to see 3 of our members, all of whom are younger than me, and I know it's getting to the point where that doesn't necessarily narrow it down, but I mean, for 3 people that I dearly love, all of whom are younger than me, to end up spending some time in the hospital and to still be there was of great concern. And by the way, to all of you who are at home, we want you to know we love you and we miss you, and we can't wait to be able to see you again, and we want you to know we're still praying for you. And that's just those who have one disease. On top of that, there was Carl, who had to go back into the hospital last week. Dave, who's had a knee replacement, which is going to require some time to recover from. Peggy has her ongoing conditions. And then, of course, to learn that our friend Josette's mother passed away unexpectedly. It was in some ways also a sad week. But it's one of those weird things that I can't tell you how many times has happened in my preaching life, where I have picked a passage to preach about, mainly just because it was what was next in the sequence of a passage of a book of the Bible, only for it to turn out to be exactly what I needed and exactly what the church needed. And that's the case this morning. Last week, when Dean stepped in at the very last minute to fill in for Nick and teach Luke 8, I had told Nick and I told Dean the same thing, that if you can't get all the way through chapter 8, don't worry, I'll preach on the last part when I get back. And I am pretentious enough to assume everybody remembers that 7 years ago, I preached on Mark's account of this same miracle. Actually, I think Nick Shar remembered that I had preached on Mark's account of this same miracle within a miracle. So this morning, I do want to talk with you about Luke's account, and it's been very interesting this past week as I studied through Luke's account to see some of the different details that he does or does not bring up as he weaves this story together. But today's sermon is about a passage that involves disease and death and the hope that Jesus gives. And I hope it will encourage you this morning. So, as you remember in Luke chapter 8, and as we saw also in Luke chapter 9, Jesus' ministry has acquired a lot of popular acclaim as he's taught and he's healed and he's cast out demons. The last story that you had studied in Luke chapter 8 was the story of the man with so many demons, they're called Legion. But Jesus completely and utterly defeats. So it is no wonder that verse 40 says, now when Jesus returned, the crowd welcomed him, for they were all waiting for him. He's acquired quite a reputation. And among the people in that multitude is a man described for us in verse 41. There came a man named Jairus, who was a ruler of the synagogue. A position, of course, of great stature and prestige in his society. But his actions here are far from dignified. Verse 41 goes on to say, falling at Jesus' feet, he implored him to come to his house. Have you ever done that? Have you ever begged someone with such fervency that you literally fell down at their feet? I've never done that. And here is a man whose position as the one who organizes the synagogue service, cares for the security of the synagogue, stores the special scroll of the law, someone who in that culture would have very high standing, for him to come and throw himself at the feet of Jesus must mean that he is desperate. Every one of you with children will understand what could make someone of such respectable standing grovel like this. The life of his child is hanging in the balance, his only child. Verse 42 says he had an only daughter about 12 years of age, and she was dying. And this is not dying like when I get a cold and I think, oh, I'm dying. No, she is at the verge of death, which would drive any parent to take the most radical steps to try to do something to help their son or daughter. And just imagine the risk he is taking with moments of his daughter's life hanging in the balance. And he chooses to risk in those final moments going to this teacher to ask him to heal his daughter. And so verse 42 says, Jesus went, and the people pressed around him. Now here's what's interesting about this word, the people pressed. This is a word that's used only one other time in Luke's gospel. It's the word that's used when Jesus tells the parable of the sower earlier in this chapter, and he talks about the thorny soil that chokes out the faith that has started to blossom because of the riches and cares and pleasures of this life. And now, here it appears as if the cares of this life, the thronging multitude pressing in about Jesus to the point that it's almost as if he's going to be choked from being able to go and to carry out his mission to help the daughter of his son, of this man Jairus. Now then, on the way, the Bible tells us about another situation. Verse 43, there was a woman who had had a discharge of blood for 12 years. Something has gone wrong with her regular cycle, such that instead of experiencing what healthy women typically do, she suffers from constant bleeding. This would be embarrassing and degrading if it were to happen to a woman in our day and time. But compounding the problem for this woman is the fact that she lives in a culture which has a law which says whenever a woman goes into her cycle, she is considered ritually unclean. And since she is irregularly bleeding, this means that she is perpetually unclean. You understand what that means? She is cut off from her people. My guess is she's not married. We don't know, but my guess is, given how long she's had this problem, that she's not married, that she has no family, and she doesn't even have a community that she can be a part of. And all of us can identify with that isolation, because a lot of us in this room have either had the virus and had to quarantine, or we've been exposed to it and had to quarantine. And I will tell you, last year, the 2 different times I had to do that, sitting alone in my house, surrounded by nothing but memories of Christy, was some of the worst weeks of my life. And when I was texting with Michelle this week, she said when they told her she was going to have to extend her stay, it was just tough to imagine that she's going to have to be in there and not see her kids. And I said, your kids, right? You know who they are, right? But she said, no, I really want to see them. So that was amazing. But I mean, we can all understand how tough this isolation is. She's experienced it 12 years. For 12 years, she has been a pariah in her own community. And not only that, the rest of verse 43 says, though she had spent all her living on physicians. And remember, Luke is a physician. The best doctors I know are also the ones most ready to acknowledge the limits of what they can do. She has looked for one doctor after the other. I know that some of you have constant chronic medical conditions, and you've gone through this experience. You've tried one doctor after another, and no one seems to be able to find the solution. And so in this woman's case, not only is she drained physically, I'm sure she had to be anemic constantly. Not only is she drained emotionally, she's isolated from everyone else in her community. She's also drained financially. She has spent all she has, and she cannot be healed by everyone. It seems about as hopeless as the story of the little girl. Speaking of which, remember how old was that little girl? Remember what Luke says? She's 12. How long has this woman had the bleeding problem? 12 years. So this is Luke's way of tying together these 2 stories. They also have in common the fact that they are both unclean. The little girl is unclean as someone who is sick, and the woman is unclean by virtue of her bleeding problem. Now, on the other hand, this woman and Jairus would seem to be quite different. First of all, his name is actually given. She is anonymous. He is a man of standing, the ruler of the synagogue. She's someone who wouldn't even be allowed to go into the synagogue. And yet, it doesn't make any difference what rung of the social ladder you're on. Heartbreaking tragedy can strike anyone. And desperation levels the playing field. Now, another common denominator between this woman and Jairus is they both think Jesus can help. Now, you may remember that the law of Moses said that men who were Jewish, who are observing the law, were to wear garments that had tassels on them. And my guess is that's particularly what she wants to touch. Verse 44, she came up behind him and touched the fringe of his garment. I am sure that part of the reason for this is she's ashamed to be out in public. She's an unclean person. And I'm sure she's also thinking, I'm unclean. If I directly contact him, I'll make him unclean. But notice also, as Ethan mentioned, the profound faith she has, that it doesn't even take direct contact with him. If she can just touch one of the fringes of his garment, she can be cleansed. And sure enough, verse 44 tells us, immediately her discharge of blood ceased. 12 years of frustration and isolation gone in an instant. I can't imagine how happy she must have been. But based on Jesus' response, it almost sounds like she did something wrong. Verse 45, Jesus said, who was it that touched me? And when all denied it, Peter said, Master, the crowd surround you and are pressing in on you. But Jesus said, someone touched me, for I perceive the power has gone out from me. So Jesus wants to know who touched him, and Peter says, well, what do you mean? There's a huge crowd here jostling all of us around. It reminds me, every time I read this, of when Christy and I went to New York City, which was just before we moved here. We traveled, we got there on Christmas Day and stayed a few days. You can imagine how jam-packed Times Square was. Now, Christy loved it because she would go stomping through these people like Godzilla through Tokyo. So this was her scene, but not me. I mean, first of all, I'm built really wide anyway, and then I had on winter clothing, so I'm even wider, and I'm getting knocked back and forth every time I'm trying to go down this sidewalk. I hated it. Well, that's what Peter's saying. Lord, how do you expect us to know who touched you? Now, do we really think that the way this works is that anybody who randomly just came up and touched Jesus could automatically siphon out miraculous power without any knowledge on the part of Jesus? I don't think Jesus is asking the question for his benefit. I think he's asking it for her benefit. To give this woman, who apparently is included in verse 45 when the text says all denied it, to give her the chance to publicly profess her faith. Verse 47, and when the woman saw that she was not hidden, she came trembling, and falling down before him, declared in the presence of all the people why she had touched him and how she had been immediately healed. She wanted something. She wanted a cure. Jesus wants someone. He wants her. And now she's publicly confessed. And so in verse 48, he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Now, could I point out to you that that same word is used in chapter 7 and verse 50, except there it's not made you well. There it's your faith has saved you. And it's in the context of Jesus talking to the sinful woman who came to the house of Simon the Pharisee. And so there he uses a word that means saved or healed to describe her spiritual condition. And now the same word is used here to describe the physical condition because, as we're talking about this year, the Lord has healing in his wings, both for our physical condition and also for our spiritual condition. But the other word that I want to point out to you that's significant in verse 48 is when Jesus refers to this woman as daughter. If I am right in surmising that she's not ever had a family, and she's not been allowed to be a part of her community, what Jesus has just said to her is, you're in the family now. Just like when he said, who is my mother and brother and sister? The one who hears the word of God is my mother, brother, and sister. She's a part of a people that will love her. But not to spoil the poignancy of that moment, the use of the word daughter reminds us, oh, by the way, there's somebody else in the story we've been reading about. It's the daughter of Jairus. And while I'm sure this woman is ecstatic to be healed, I would imagine if I was Jairus, I'm not so happy. Because let's face it, this woman has had this problem for 12 years. What's one more hour gonna make a difference one way or the other? But every minute is precious as the clock ticks down on his daughter's life. I will never forget once when I was a little boy and I had recurrent problems with strep throat. And my mom took me to my doctor, to the pediatrician's office. And of course, as a little kid with the fever, I felt terrible. And it seemed like it took hours for us to get in. And I know it took a long enough time that my mom, when we finally got in to see him, blew her top that her son, who was sick, had to be made to wait so long. But can you imagine what Jairus must be feeling? And then can you imagine how his heart broke when he receives the worst news imaginable for a parent in verse 49? While he was still speaking, someone from the ruler's house came and said, your daughter is dead. And as far as this person is concerned, it is hopeless. So hopeless, there's no point of even bothering the teacher anymore. do not trouble him. And of course, considering the fact that there had been this delay in such a moment of urgency, it seems almost amazing that Jairus would have to hear Jesus say in verse 50, do not fear, only believe, and she will be well. That indicates to me that his demeanor must have changed from someone with desperate hope to someone who is just now simply distraught. But Jesus assures him, this situation is not beyond hope. And if it took hope for him to come look for Jesus to begin with, I can't imagine the hope and faith it took for him to go with Jesus back to the house. Verse 51, when he came to the house, he allowed no one to enter with him except Peter and John and James and the father and mother of the child, maybe out of respect for the situation. I do know that in that day and time, there would have been present women who almost have as their job as professionals to show up when someone passes away and to lament. Jesus calls them the daughters of Jerusalem as he's being led to his crucifixion. Verse 52 tells us that all were weeping and mourning for her. I mean, as tough as it was to see Christy fight cancer, there is nothing that can compare to seeing a little child, as we would periodically see little children who have cancer. There's nothing that can compare to the suffering of a child, not to mention the brokenheartedness of the father who has seen his only hope for a future family line end. But Jesus says in verse 52, do not weep. For she is not dead, but sleeping. And they laughed at him. I presume, not Peter, James, and John, and not the girl's parents. I presume these women who had come to mourn. Who, if there's anything they know, is when somebody is dead. And so the idea that somehow this little girl is going to rise, that this is just a temporary kind of sleep, is laughable to them. Verse 54, but taking her by the hand. Now, if you were to put all of chapter 8 together, you could almost say that its theme is uncleanness. Remember, there's the man with the unclean spirit, the demons, the legion. Then there is the woman with the bleeding disease who is unclean, and certainly a corpse. And yet in all three situations, rather than that which is unclean making Jesus unclean, instead he can make that which is unclean clean. And so the text says he took her by the hand. He didn't have to touch her. We know that Jesus did miracles even from some distance away. But almost as if to say, let me show you how I can take the unclean and make it clean, he took her by the hand and called, saying, child, arise. Now, since we just commemorated the Lord's death and resurrection, since we just remembered the power of the Lord over death, I almost just let verses like this roll right by without putting myself in the position of Jairus and the other people present. How astonishing it would be to see Jesus speak the word to this little girl and tell her to arise. And in verse 55 it says, her spirit returned and she got up at once, just like the woman was healed immediately. She rises at once. And some of you parents are thinking, this dead girl rises at once. I can't get my kid to wake up in 20 minutes of hollering at him, right? So maybe you'd like to have some miracle go on in yours. I know it took 3 times for me. The first one was, Shane, time to get up. Shane Scott, time to get up. And then, Paul Shane Scott, you better get up before. And then all kinds of threats would take place, all right? Well, in this instance, Jesus just says, child, arise. And this girl gets up immediately. And he directs that she should be given something to eat. And in verse 56, her parents were amazed. But by now we are ready for this command. He charged them to tell no one what had happened because, of course, you don't want to spread the word about Jesus' miracles without people understanding his identity and what his mission is. So here's the application I want all of us to see. You may feel like Jesus would never want anything to do with you. That he would never let you approach him directly, like maybe the woman felt. Or maybe you have voices whispering in your ear why trouble the teacher any further? But what Jesus would say to you is, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed. He died to be able to say to all of us, arise. And the great thing we learn from these stories, and the only part of my thunder Ethan stole, is you don't have to have perfect faith for Jesus to say that. But as I said to Ethan when we were chatting a bit, it won't hurt us to hear this lesson a couple times today. I am in awe of the faith of Jairus and of this woman. But even their impressive faith was not flawless. He needed reassuring. She was a little sneaky. And yet Jesus took that imperfect faith because they knew at least this much. They needed help, and Jesus was the only one who could give it to them. I imagine they were both very scared. I can certainly imagine this father being terrified as he left the house. And I can imagine how afraid this woman must have been to dare go into public, into a crowd, just to try to hold on to a piece of fabric. But that's what's so assuring. Jesus does not require perfect faith. And as scary as it may be for any of us to come to him, he just says to us, do not fear, only believe. And our hope is that for all of us spiritually, he will say, daughter, son, arise. And we have the hope that even for all of our loved ones who have passed from this life, that someday on the last day, on the great day, he will say, arise. That is the healing in his wings. It's the healing we offer you today. If you are ready in your faith to come to Jesus and be baptized into him, to be united to him, so that his death and resurrection becomes yours, we'd love to help you do that. And if you're a child of God in need of encouragement, I hope your faith is strengthened this morning. Let us know how we can help you while we stand and sing together.
Thank everybody for coming. It's certainly been a blessing to be here. And if you're visiting with us, be sure to fill out a visitor's card for us. We'll have a closing prayer, and then